All right, picture this. You're in central Alabama right now, and you're staring out at Lake Martin. It is beautiful, right? 44,000 acres of this crystal clear water, luxury cabins, people zipping around on jet skis, practically baking in that bright southern sun. It is a literal paradise. But I want you to hold on to that perfect sunny image for a second, because what we are going to unpack today is the absolutely shocking reality hiding directly underneath all those jet skis.
It's honestly a mind-bending contrast. Like, if you could somehow dive hundreds of feet straight down into the pitch black of that lake bed and scrape away a century's worth of mud, you wouldn't just find some rocks and sunken logs. No, you would find a literal drowned 1920s empire. We're talking perfectly intact brick foundations, massive bank vaults, the remains of an electric power plant, even a full railway line. An entire century of water is currently hiding this astonishing piece of American history right under our noses.
All right, let's get into section 1, Alabama's forgotten Black Empire. So how exactly does an entire industrial empire end up sitting at the bottom of a luxury lake? Well, to figure that out, we have to travel back to the late 1890s. And fair warning, this is going to completely shatter what a lot of people think they know about the deep American South. Because buried down there is Kowaliga. This was an independent, incredibly wealthy town built entirely by freed slaves and their children. And it all started with the philosophy of its founder, William Benson. Benson was born into slavery, but he had this fundamental realization. He knew that true freedom didn't just come from a piece of paper. It came from land, and it came from capital. You see, while most Black Americans in the South following emancipation were trapped in the sharecropping system, which, let's be real, was just a vicious cycle designed to keep them in perpetual debt, Benson completely bypassed it. He went out, bought up thousands of acres of supposedly worthless timberland, and rallied other Black families to come build a community from the ground up.
And you have to understand, this wasn't some tiny, struggling farming village. The sheer scale of Kowaliga's success by the 1920s is absolutely staggering. They launched the Dixie Industrial Company, which was this massive corporation with Black shareholders running advanced sawmills and brick kilns. They built the Kowaliga Railway, the very first and only fully operational railroad built, owned, and operated entirely by Black engineers. That connected them straight into national trade routes. They even built a massive boarding school for engineering and business. It was, for all intents and purposes, a highly sophisticated, self-sufficient mini-metropolis, operating completely outside of the white-dominated economy.
Moving on to section 2, the threat of autonomy.
Now picture the 1920s in the heart of Jim Crow, Alabama. The state literally expected Black citizens to step off the sidewalk for white people. Yet over in Kowaliga, Black citizens were operating commercial locomotives and generating their own electricity. It was an extreme contrast. The traditional Southern economy relied on one thing: cheap, exploitable labor. So if Black families suddenly realized, hey, we can just move to Kowaliga, work for a Black-owned corporation, and actually build generational wealth, well, the plantation economy would face total collapse. To the surrounding white elite and the state government, Kowaliga wasn't an inspiring underdog story. It was a massive existential threat. But here's the catch. Kowaliga was big. It was economically integrated, and importantly, it was protected by its own armed security. So a traditional violent mob attack, like the horrific massacres we saw in Tulsa or Rosewood, that wasn't going to work here. It risked triggering an all-out civil war.
Which brings us to section 3, the legal weapon.
Since traditional violence risked civil war, the state and those wealthy elites needed a different tool, a silent one. Enter the Thomas Wesley Martin Hydroelectric Dam, a massive project spearheaded by the Alabama Power Company. On the surface, they sold this to the public as a noble, progressive push for modernization and clean energy. But the underlying legal mechanism making it possible? Eminent domain. That's the right of a government to just step in and seize private property for public use. And here is where it gets incredibly dark. When the engineers laid out the topographical maps for this new dam, out of all the possible valleys and rivers in the entire state, the flood zone was calculated to perfectly, and I mean perfectly, engulf the exact coordinates of Kowaliga. The trajectory of those floodwaters was literally aimed straight at the heart of Black economic independence.
Section 4, drowning a metropolis. So the trap is sprung. By 1923, corporate agents, fully backed by state law enforcement, start rolling into the bustling streets of Kowaliga, and they back the landowners into an absolutely impossible corner. The deal was essentially, accept absolute pennies on the dollar for your highly valuable developed land, or face total seizure by the state and walk away with zero. The psychological warfare here was just immense. We actually have this chilling account from a descendant of a Kowaliga resident.
They said, "They came to our homes with papers in one hand and guns in the other. They told us the water was coming, and if we weren't gone when it arrived, we would sleep with the fish." They were forcing an entire population into exile under the threat of a watery grave.
From there, the physical dismantling of the town was incredibly cold and systematic. In 1923, eminent domain is officially granted. By 1924, they're aggressively clearing out the timber, and the Kowaliga Railway, the literal lifeline of their wealth, is brutally uprooted right from the ground. Then in 1925 comes maybe the most devastating blow of all. The state orders thousands of ancestral graves to be exhumed. And if families couldn't afford to move their loved ones fast enough, the state simply left them behind. Hundreds of graves just abandoned in the mud.
And that brings us to 1926, the final, inescapable moment. The floodgates of the dam close, the Tallapoosa River starts to back up, and the water slowly creeps into the streets. You have to imagine this. It's swallowing the storefronts. It's pouring into the lower floors of that massive brick college. It is completely submerging these beautiful homes that families had spent 30 hard years building from scratch. A bustling mini metropolis of thousands of people was deliberately drowned. And just like that, Kowaliga became Lake Martin.
Section 5. The Strategic Erasure.
But you see, the physical destruction of the buildings and the railway, that was really just phase 1. Phase 2 was a calculated, decades-long campaign of historical erasure. For decades, official state archives and textbooks strategically omitted the Dixie Industrial Company. They completely left out the Black-owned railway. Instead, they just vaguely dismissed Kowaliga as some tiny rural settlement that sadly had to be moved for the sake of clean energy. They rewrote the entire narrative to make it look like the government simply brought modern progress to the wilderness, hiding the historical reality that a corporate monopoly intentionally drowned a thriving industrial superpower.
And then there is the bitter, ultimate irony of it all. For decades after Lake Martin was created, Jim Crow segregation laws were strictly enforced. That meant the displaced families of Kowaliga and their children were legally barred from even swimming in the lake. They couldn't rent cabins, they couldn't buy property on the exact shores that sat directly on top of their own buried ancestral homes. It's just wild to think about.
When you total it all up, we're talking about hundreds of millions of dollars. That is the modern equity value of the generational wealth that was stolen from these families. Wealth that was systematically wiped out and instantly transferred right into the hands of a corporate monopoly and the elite wealthy property owners who bought up all that newly created luxury real estate. Honestly, it was one of the quietest yet most brutally effective transfers of wealth in American history.
Finally, Section 6, The Truth Rises.
For almost a century, that erasure worked perfectly. But history has a really funny way of refusing to stay buried. Today we've got modern historians, divers using advanced sonar tech, and, most importantly, the dedicated descendants of Kowaliga itself, finally piercing through 100 years of silence. They are mapping the lakebed, they are piecing this drowned empire back together, and they are forcing the world to look beneath the surface. Kowaliga is a stark, powerful reminder that sometimes history isn't just lost by accident. Sometimes it's intentionally drowned. So the next time you're standing at the edge of a massive man-made lake, or a beautiful park, or really any American landmark that seems just a little too perfect, you've got to ask yourself, what was here before the water came, and exactly whose story had to be erased so this one could be told?